And joining us now in Calgary, Alberta, Preston Manning, former leader of the Reform Party of Canada and president of the Manning Centre for Building Democracy. And with us here in studio, John Duffy, principal with Strategy Corp. Erna Paris, the author and journalist. Andrew Coyne, the newly minted columnist for Post Media newspaper chain. And John Ibbotson, the Ottawa bureau chief of the Globe and Mail. Earlier today, John delivered a talk entitled "The Collapse of the Laurentian Consensus and Ontario's Rise as a Pacific Province." Now that chat will air on TVO's Big Ideas program this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, 5 p.m. But in the meantime, we've invited you to come here to have a brief discussion entre nous, and then these guys get to pick apart your speech and see what they think of it.
I have no idea how much I'm looking forward to.
You game for that? Okay, let's go. First of all, welcome everybody to the program. Nice to have you all here. Andrew, your first time with the Post. Mr. Manning, great to have you on the line from Western Canada. John, I know as journalists we all like to think that every single election we cover is the most important one ever. You tell us most of the time they aren't, but the one that we had this past year, May 2nd, you think was.
I think it was one of the most important elections, probably the most important election since the 1988 free trade debate, because it marked the collapse of the Laurentian Consensus. But what is the Laurentian Consensus, and should we celebrate or mourn its passing? It's a term we came up with to describe the media, business, cultural, political, academic elites in the big cities along the St. Lawrence watershed, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and the others. And for most of this country's history, these elites wrestled with the great issues of the day, forged a consensus, and implemented that consensus.
So who are the elites you're talking about?
These would be university academics, newspaper editors and writers, business leaders who had a strong, political bent as well, public policy analysts. You can run down a great long list of
Liberal
names.
Party of Canada?
The Liberal Party of Canada was very much the political expression of the Laurentian Consensus. But there were Conservative prime ministers too, who operated very much within the consensus. Brian Mulroney was one of them. And they governed, I would contend, they governed us well. They gave us a pretty fine country. But they failed to recognize that things were changing in the country, that the West, which was always outside the consensus, was emerging as a more powerful, more prosperous, and more heavily populated region of the country. They failed to recognize that the suburban middle-class voters in the big suburbs surrounding not just Toronto, but other cities as well, were becoming increasingly disengaged from their own priorities, their own values, and were increasingly attracted to values that were coming out of the West. And they failed to recognize especially that immigrant Canadians, who had always embraced the Liberal Party, were themselves coming from different places, from Asia, from Pacific Island nations, and that they had different values, values that resonated more closely with an emerging coalition of conservatives, again, based in the West. And the election was important, the election was vital, because it marked the great fundamental shift of these voters in Ontario away from the downtown elites and towards the new rising Western power in the form of the Conservative government and the collapse of the Laurentian Consensus.
Let's put some numbers up here and just put your thesis to a bit of a test right here. I want to compare the election results of May 2nd with where we are right now in the polls and see what you think of these. Okay, Michael, let's start to reveal this if we can. The Conservatives in the last polling, most recently done, are at about 36%, which is just about 4 off from where they were on Election Day. The Liberals, they've gone up a lot, actually, 10 points up since Election Day. New Democrats are off just a few points from Election Day, thanks to Nick Nanos for those numbers. But if you add them all up, does it not still suggest that this country is essentially 60-40 center-left political split?
I think that's a fair comment. Although if you look at the key ridings that switched in the course of this last election, the 905 ridings that surround Toronto especially, you see there large majorities in most cases for the Conservatives. And of course, you never know what would happen if indeed the left did coalesce into a political party, whether a great many of those, I call them John Manley liberals, would flee to the Conservatives. What we also know from Nick Nanos is that if you ask people how the country is doing, that poll came out just this afternoon, how is the country doing? How do people feel about Canada? The numbers are incredibly robust. I think it's 65%, something like that, in the area of countries going in the right direction. Well up, in fact, from a year ago. So I don't think you should be looking at individual polls. I think you should be looking at trend lines and the shift of big demographic groups away from one party and one set of values, more important, to another party and another set of values.
Let's do one more thing before we get everybody else involved here, and that is the notion of Ontario on its way to becoming a Pacific province.
You didn't hear about the earthquake.
I did not.
What I mean by that is, again, we're bringing in 250,000 immigrants a year, Toronto every decade. And most of them settle in Ontario, and most of them settle in and around Toronto. Most of them are from Pacific nations. China and India and the Philippines are our three biggest sources of immigrants. They have different values than, let's say, Southern and Eastern European immigrants who came in after the Second World War. And the Conservative message appeals to them. I took a look at about half a dozen ridings in the 905 with very high visible minority populations. Every one of them in the last election switched from the Liberals to the Conservatives.
All went Tory.
All went Tory. So the Liberal vote, or the immigrant vote, which was always a Liberal vote, has become a Conservative vote. And because they're from the Pacific and Asia, and those values are their values, and Asia is rising as a new economic power, and they're shifting their vote to the Western-based party, they are turning Ontario into an increasingly Pacific nation.
Okay, let's get everybody else involved in this as well. Preston Manning, want to start with you in Calgary tonight. John Ibbitson, of course, quoted your famous line in his speech, "The West wants in," but he went further by saying, "It is in fact, it's in charge." You buying that?
Well, it certainly has more influence now than it used to. Now, I think John's basic thesis is correct. I look at it positively, of course. I don't see the collapse of the Laurentian consensus as a particularly bad thing. I think what's emerging is a new alignment in federal politics, particularly in support of the federal government, and it is now an alignment between the West and Ontario rather than the old alignment with between Ontario and Quebec. But I think that's basically a positive thing, and I think a whole number of forces contributed to achieving it.
How long do you think it's been in the works for?
Oh, a long time, 20, 25 years. When the Reform Party started, it was trying to give expression to get the West to define itself as the new West rather than the old West. There's been a lot of people in Western Canada for years have argued that the Foreign Affairs Department looked too much to the Atlantic and not enough to the Pacific. That's all changed. I think it's been in the works for a long time, but as John said, on May the 2nd, it really became clear that the political center of gravity of the country has shifted further west.
Andrew Coyne, you also had a sense on May the 2nd that this was an election unlike any other, or many others. Here's what you wrote back in the days when you worked at Maclean's magazine. "This is not like the sudden sweeps of John Diefenbaker and Brian Mulroney, born of the collapse of previous Liberal governments, only to collapse of their own internal contradictions. This is one that has been built slowly, election after election, through defeat and victory." So the question is this more than political savvy by Stephen Harper? Is there something else that was happening in the country over the past 20, 25 years, as Mr. Manning suggested, that he was able to capitalize on but was deeper?
It's both. I mean, I hate to give that answer where you always say both, but you have to give him some credit for pulling that together and for accelerating, if you will. But there's no doubt. I mean, John talks about Ontario becoming a Pacific nation. I would be less dramatic than that in saying it's becoming a province. It's becoming more of a Western province. It's not just the pull of the immigrants, not just the pull of the Pacific Rim. It's the pull of Alberta. It's the pull of the collective weight of the provinces now in Western Canada. That's a matter of population shift. If you go back to 100 years ago, Quebec had 30% of the population. The West only had 10%. At the time of the National Energy Program, they had roughly similar populations. Now the population of Alberta and BC alone exceeds that of Quebec. So the center of gravity has been shifting. When I first moved to Ontario 25 years or so ago, it was a much different province than it was. It was much more distinct political cultures between Ontario and the West. It has been looking further to the West as time has gone on, has taken more of its inspiration, sees more of its interests align with the West. I dare say if you looked at air travel between Toronto and Montreal versus Toronto and Calgary, I bet you the balance has shifted. Things like that, I think is just, as Preston said, the center of gravity is moving west.
John Duffy, before I ask you this question, I have to ask John Ibbitson something. Was John Duffy, or is John Duffy, part of the Laurentian consensus?
Well, I gave the speech at Bloor Street and Avenue Road, so I was deep in the heart of it. Look, I think it's not just Liberals, and John is a self-avowed Liberal, I believe.
Yes, he is.
Who are part of the Laurentian consensus. It's everyone who...
I know, but is he part of it?
Of course he is.
He is,
yes.
okay. So, because I needed your good housekeeping.
Well, you could argue that there's
approval.
no one at this table who isn't part of it, frankly.
Well, let's try this then. Okay, John, given that you are part of the Laurentian consensus, see, this is why I needed to get that confirmation. Do you agree with him that its days are done?
I have utterly collapsed in my incarnation as the liberal consensus which you have put upon me. I think I'm kind of halfway there on this. I'll meet John halfway on it. I do think that the structure of national governance that he's described is really gone. I think it's been going for an awfully long time. The kind of monolithic common room decision-making consensus that John describes is really out of the 1950s rather than, and 40s and 30s, rather than even the 80s or 90s. I think Trudeau did an enormous amount to actually shake that up with the Charter, which changed the relationship between the governed and the government fundamentally. I'd make this point. I will stick up for the political savvy of Prime Minister Harper, perhaps over these great tectonic movements. In this regard, look at the numbers. In 1949, a high water mark of the Laurentian consensus, in that election, the government was returned with approximately 35% of the electorate.
That would be the Liberal government.
Yeah, of the overall eligible to vote. Okay? 1980, 33%. Last election, it's actually 25%. Now, what's the secret here? The secret here is declining voter turnout, as well as having a smaller but more efficient vote. Okay, now these are sort of not terribly sexy concepts, but the reality is the Harper government, for all its vaunted majority, and my hat goes off to them, it's not some technicality, they won it fair and square.
But they did it with 25% of the
They
vote.
govern on 25% of the vote. And this explains a lot of things. It explains a lot on 25% of the people eligible to vote.
You should just
explains
explain
why
that,
they
John.
why they're continuing. A lot of people are puzzled. Why are these guys who've won this big majority still governing as though they have a minority and they got to fight in the alleyway every inch of the way? It's because their actual governing base in the country is still quite small for a Canadian government. And so while I agree the Laurentian consensus that John's described is definitely an eclipse, and there are a lot of reasons for that, I don't see the thing replacing it that John has described. I see less of a realignment per Preston Manning and more of a de-alignment where there's simply less of these monolithic power blocks than there ever has been in this country.
We should just explain, because people are thinking, what do you mean 25%? They got 39.5%. But they got 39.5% of the 49% of people who voted, which turns into 25%.
58 federal.
58.
58 federally, excuse me, is 49 Ontario.
That's right.
52?
You line it up.
52. 52%
You line it
of
up
voters.
apples to apples, and basically the Trudeau governments in their heyday were running at about 30% of those eligible to vote, and the Harper government is running at about a quarter of those eligible to vote. And you can feel the difference out there. It doesn't feel as firmly moving the country in one direction as maybe one day it will, maybe one day it won't. So I don't see it having happened quite as far along as John would have it.
Okay, Erna, your turn here, and once again, I quote you back to yourself, because before the election took place, you wrote this in the March issue of the Walrus magazine. You wrote, "For a very long time, Canadians have spoken of shared social values as a way of bridging our traditional French-English solitudes. Now I ask myself whether we might be morphing into two Canadas, each with a distinct worldview. The more familiar Canada has promoted secular, humanist values, expressing them in a welfare society it took decades to build. The newer Canada is brasher, harder, and angrier. You may have guessed that the kinder Canada is the country I cleave to. It has been my heart's home wherever I have traveled in the world. But I recognize change, and I am beginning to question how and if we can find common ground." Is your kind of Canada diminished because the French-English question is simply no longer central to our national sense of politics today?
Oh, I wouldn't say that. And I also wouldn't say that the French-English issue has gone away for good. I think the demise of the Laurentian consensus, I mean, it's obvious after the last election that that has happened, but rumors of the death of this particular patient may be exaggerated, and in that I would agree with John. I'm not a policy wonk. But I do think about Robertson Davies, who said once, "Canada is a place we worry about." And of course, we always do, and we always have. I worry that we are becoming two countries in terms of values. And I think this is a tremendous concern. The
Who are
fact,
the two countries?
pardon me. Well,
Where
the two
are the
countries.
two countries?
Where are the two countries? Well, I think John made a case today that, of course, one of the countries is in the West, but not entirely. I mean, we have a new premier in Alberta who is a small L liberal, if I ever saw one, at least in terms of her background. And the mayor of Calgary as well comes from a minority background. So I don't think we're looking at monoliths there, and I certainly don't think we're looking at monoliths here in the East either. So I believe we have to be careful about overstating perhaps what's happening. But the other thing I would like to say is that this Laurentian consensus had one goal, one task, which it tried to accomplish from the beginning of Confederation, and that was nation building. And they did it from a kind of woolly center, from a pragmatic center. And look what they had to deal with. They had, impossible geography, they had hostility between French and English, and they had to integrate minorities. So they brought in programs and institutions that could do that. And what is this new consensus going to replace that with? Canadian identity is a pretty fragile thing.
That's a pretty good question for Preston Manning. Mr. Manning, what do you think this new consensus, whatever you want to call it, it's not the Laurentian consensus, whatever you want to call it, what's it going to do?
The first thing I'd say is I don't think we should have such a pessimistic view of all this. It's true that the Laurentian worldview has sort of faded in support, but that's to be expected. That set of values can't go on forever, and it's going to be replaced by something new, and that's what we're struggling to find. I think this is a positive development. Something old is dying, but something new is being born, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. I think some of the new common ground that's emerging, we did some polling that week immediately after the federal election, which indicated pretty strongly that the center of the political spectrum, where all Canadians eventually gravitate, is just getting more blue than red. There seems to be a growing consensus on the role of government, a rejection of the idea that big government solutions to big problems, whether they're social, economic, or environmental, people just don't think they work. But that doesn't mean they're anti-government. They're looking at a role for government that is government as a facilitator and an enabler and a partner with other stakeholders to get things done. I think that's a characteristic of this new alignment, and it's a positive development. I think there's other positive features as well.
John Ibbotson, do you think it's an unambiguously positive development in the nation's history?
Well,
I didn't say it was unambiguous, but I did say there's a positive side to it, rather than mourning the collapse of the Laurentian consensus.
No, I hear you, Mr. Manning, but I presume you think it's more positive than negative.
Yes, I do. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I think, first of all, that the new, whatever it is, because it's not a consensus yet, embraces a lot of the old consensus. Healthcare, in the fundamentals of foreign policy, in social policy, in income redistribution. It's not as though, the Tea Party is replacing the Northeastern Democrats. This is still a profoundly consensual country. But these things having been achieved, there is a growing emphasis on government needs to rein in, government needs to be smaller. I'm concerned about the Conservatives', well, not ambivalence, but complete and outright lack of interest in environmental issues and other things. But I think I would go so far as to agree with Mr. Manning that, generally speaking, the country is a stronger country when different parts of it have a voice and have a say. The expansion of that voice into the West surely is a positive thing.
I wouldn't exaggerate the shift that's going on. Frankly, I'm a little bit of parting company with John on this question of whether there was a Laurentian consensus. There was a consensus among some people in the Laurentian area. As I recall, there were some pretty nasty fights amongst Laurentian elites over things like free trade, conscription, Quebec's place in Canada. So we can tend to gloss those over, I think, in the interest of a thesis. And I think similarly, as John is saying, the degree to which this new coalition, this new government actually is departing from that can be overstated as well. They do on some things for some purposes, but they've absorbed a great deal of it as well. I would say to some extent unnecessarily, but they certainly view it as being necessary on their march to power. So these are differences of degrees, movements within the 45-yard lines more than anything else.
John Duffy?
Yeah, I think it's more that, and I certainly don't believe that you know, the picture here of a government and a governing arrangement that rests on some sort of emerging new consensus, I can't agree with, and I'll tell you why. Because the consensus that you're describing, that John's describing, really I see as a change in the software. It's a change in attitudes and ideas. I think what's happened actually that's caused these political outcomes has more to do with the hardware. The political system has changed. How you win in it has changed. Those changes are infinitely more dramatic. The rise of new technology, the segmentation of the electorate by market research, the eclipse of even television from a 3-network system to a 500-channel universe, let alone social media. The changes in how spending works, the end of corporate donations, the rise of the individual small donor that Preston Manning did so much to bring about. All of these things have created a totally new environment for politics to occur. And what has happened, I think, more than a great shift in the software, is that within this new hardware, the Conservative Party has learned how to operate in that environment much better than anybody else. That's what enables them to govern with only 25% of the electorate. It's not a consensus. It's really, and it's not a fundamental change in the attitudes of the country. I just think people with different attitudes are now in charge because they've done a much better job of learning how to operate in the new environment. Not to take away from what changes may have occurred, but I think those changes in the hardware are actually probably more important in dictating these outcomes than changes in attitudes, particularly Ontario becoming Pacific in some way.
You just grimaced in the middle of your
Well,
answer.
just to drag it back
to
just to drag it back to the regional focus, though, it seems to me there's two facts that need to be considered here. One is the Tories have owned Western Canada for 60 years, and it's only gotten more strong over time. The last election, they took 55% of the vote west of Ontario. So that's the most established fact in Canadian politics. People talk about Quebecers' tendency to vote as a bloc. Quebecers got nothing on Western Canada and its tendency to vote Conservative. They've now added Ontario, at least for this election. We'll see how permanent this is, but they've added Ontario after knocking on the door for several elections, increasing their percentage of the vote, increasing their number of seats in Ontario each successive election. You put those two together, that's a pretty solid block. You mentioned off the top that I had compared this differentiating from Mulroney and the Diefenbaker sweeps. Those things blew up overnight. They swept the country, and then, as I say, they had their own internal contradictions. But if you put together Ontario in the West with a pretty consistently small C conservative, keep my taxes low, keep my streets safe message, that's a much more durable looking, to me, much more durable looking coalition, and the kind that can win a lot of elections.
I have to say with Andrew on this. I mean, there are two,
And no Quebec.
And not to diss John, but there are too many Liberals who think our message is right. Our message is still the national message. Our message is still the consensus, but they've got better computer programs and they target voters better than we do. And once we get our computer software up and running, we'll target voters better and we'll win too. Now, there's a change in the message. There's a change in the place where message resonates, and there are changes in the power and importance of certain regions of the country over other regions.
Let me challenge you a little bit on that, because here's Preston Manning's friend Tom Flanagan, writing in the Literary Review of Canada last month, November, in which he said, Stephen Harper has adopted the liberal shibboleths of bilingualism and multiculturalism. He has no plans to reintroduce capital punishment, criminalize abortion, repeal gay marriage, or repeal the Charter. He swears allegiance to the Canada Health Act. He has enriched equalization payments for the provinces and POGI for individuals. He has enthusiastically accepted government subsidies to business while enlarging regional economic expansion. Preston Manning, the Conservatives have only been successful because they've learned to compromise with the notion that Canada is still a center-left country. That seems to be what Tom Flanagan is saying. What do you think?
Well, I think, and this is one place where I disagree a little bit with John and his analysis and Erna's analysis as well. I don't think trying to interpret this shift in left-right terms is particularly the right way to look at it. I think a lot of Canadians voted for Stephen Harper because they felt he was the leader most competent to deal with the economic the frailty of the economic recovery. I think a very large number of Quebecers, and I think this is going to be proven by some of the later polling, voted for Jack Layton because he was a winsome personality. And I think the polling is showing that many Quebecers didn't have the foggiest notion what the NDP stood for, either ideologically or policy-wise. And I think trying to interpret this whole thing within a left-right center spectrum is that's again part of the old politics, not part of the new.
Erna? Sorry, and then John.
Well, I agree, Mr. Manning, Preston, that the economic downturn did move people towards the Conservatives. There's no question about that. But the Conservative messaging, which is ultra important for this government. I mean, there's nothing more important than its messaging. I read last week there's something like 1,500 people in Ottawa who are working on messaging alone. The Conservative message is not the message that Canadians have lived with. It is not an inclusive message of a public good. And like it or not, the Laurentian Consensus, or whatever we want to call it, did eventually promote this inclusivity. It did try to integrate. It did try to create a sense of national identity, fragile though it always was, that put the idea of a public good forward and above all. And as John pointed out in his speech tonight, these are not the values of the party. So if it is true that in fact Canadians do still cleave to the centre, it is perhaps possible, even likely, that once the economy comes back into shape, that this particular message, the message we are getting from the Conservative Party, will not resonate, particularly, I'd add, if the two parties on the left unite.
Let me get Preston Manning's view on that, and then we'll go to John Duffy. Go ahead, Mr. Manning.
Well, I think the future of this new alignment depends in part on what the government does with it. They can't take this new alignment or alliance between Quebec or between Ontario and the West for granted. If they build on it and strengthen it so that this becomes the alignment for years to come, that's one thing, and there's a lot of work to be done on that. I think the Western provinces have gradually got a free trade agreement among themselves to try to knock down some of these interprovincial barriers. If that was to be extended to include Manitoba and Ontario, that would consolidate this base even more. A lot of the manufacturing for the burgeoning energy industry is being done in Ontario, and if that alliance strengthens, if Ontario people recognize the vested interest they have in a strong energy industry, particularly in the West, that's pulling this thing together. So I think a lot of the future depends on whether this new alignment is strengthened. The other side of this, a worrisome thing, I think, for the government is the weakness of the economy east of the Ottawa River. I think we're going to see there's a danger of us seeing a phenomenon now of Eastern alienation. And in fact, if somebody wants to organize the East Wants In campaign, I have a few files that they might want to look at. But I do think from the standpoint of national unity, the Canadians generally have to worry about Quebec and the Maritimes feeling alienated from this new alignment and take steps to repair that. I happen to think those steps are not ones particularly that the federal government can take, but are steps that need to be taken more by the provincial governments. Ontario and Quebec should get a free trade agreement, and things that can be done by the private sector, particularly the electric utility or export industry in Quebec, getting together more with the oil and gas people in Western Canada.
John Duffy.
Well, we're starting to actually come to grips with what I think is the heart of the matter, which is Quebec. And that's a very Laurentian thing of me to say.
I was just going to say, it's only the heart of the matter for Laurentian people.
Well, except that when you look at how all of this came about, I think the seminal event is the 1993 election and the exit of Quebec from national governance parties. It's indeed possible to argue, and we'll see how all this plays out with the future and fate of the NDP, particularly in this leadership. It's entirely possible that Quebec did not come into a national governance arrangement on May 2nd with the New Democrats so much as it found a different way, a less confrontational and stale way to express its opposition. If you want to look at what has put the basic governing arrangements of the country, the Laurentian Consensus, if you will, into play, it has been Quebec's exit from that consensus, which happened by degrees, but certainly the big crack-up public electoral moment of it was 1993.
Remind everybody what happened.
Well, that was when the Progressive Conservative Party of Kim Campbell, but deeded to her by Brian Mulroney, was wiped out nationwide, and when Quebec swung decisively to the Bloc Québécois with, I guess, what it was, about 65 of 70 seats, something overwhelming, about 60 of 75 seats, excuse me. From then on in, Quebec has been outside of national governance, despite the best efforts of the Conservatives, not the best efforts of the Liberals, frankly, who have not been on their game in Quebec for over a generation. I think, look, we're talking about moving large blocks, so let's play that game for a second. The closest that anyone in national politics in the Canadian history has ever come to erecting a durable political coalition with Ontario at its core was the Chrétien-Martin fourth era of Liberal dominance, which lasted for a grand total of 12 years. Okay? That's not exactly a long run in these sorts of things. Ontario is actually probably too big to move as a bloc and to be the core. And that Chrétien-Martin dominance in Ontario was based very much on vote splitting, as we now understand and recognize. So when you look at the great historical durable coalitions of Canadian politics, they're usually Quebec and the West. What's being attempted here is something that's never been tried, and it's being tried because the West is now strong enough to be a major bloc coalition partner, and Ontario is fragmented enough to actually be willing to go along with this, parts of it. But I'm not at all convinced that you're going to see any sort of long-term Canadian realignment that doesn't account for Quebec. And one of these days, I think Quebec is either going to come back into politics as part of something or restate very aggressively its willingness to force negotiations in a way that will make this moment when it looked like a new alignment was coming in seem very chimerical indeed.
Andrew.
None of us really knows what's going to happen in Quebec, John included, I included. It's in a very interesting period in Quebec, a lot of flux. They've just given a bunch of seats to the Democrats federally. They look like they're about to give a bunch of seats to François Legault's right-of-center party provincially. There's a lot going on there that's hard to fathom. It's conceivable we're going to enter into a different phase of politics in Quebec where they won't give all their seats to one party or another. That's good news, I think, from a lot of perspectives, and particularly from the Conservative perspective. Conservatives only won 5 seats in Quebec, and you can say, well, that's bad from one perspective because you'd like to see them getting representation in all parts of the country. The good news is it allows them to approach Quebec at their leisure. The disease of conservative parties over the past several decades is this tendency to make Hail Mary passes, trying to get 50 seats in Quebec, trying to wrest away control of Quebec from the Liberal dominance. If they can now approach them in a different way of not trying to promise them the moon, but just quietly approach them and try and get maybe 20 seats in Quebec on a small C conservative message, and there's more receptivity to that in Quebec now than there would have been in the past when the national question dominated everything. That starts to present a much healthier picture both for the party and for the country. Last point I'd make is, conversely, that dominance of the Conservatives in the West, it'll be interesting to see whether that continues. There are good social and economic reasons why the West, you would think, would tend to be small C conservative, but a big part of it may simply be this was the opposition party. The West has been, for most of the last 60 years, has been out of power. This was the home team. This was the party that represented the West against those Eastern bastards. If it starts to dawn on the West that, wait a minute, we're now in control of the thing, we're not the opposition, we're now the government, does that start to leave open ways for other parties to start to carve off support and for the West to become less monolithic in the future?
What do you think on that last point?
Yeah, at the speech, one of the questions was, what is this going to do to the notion of Western alienation? And I said, well, it's time they got over it. That, you know, obviously Calgary and Edmonton and Vancouver are very much part of this. I think as well, one of the things that Mr. Manning pointed out is important. We've seen this been going on for a long time, and again, that's why I say these are tectonic. Everything east of the Ottawa River is in economic decline, with the exception of Newfoundland and Labrador. Everything sort of west of the Ottawa River is in a troubled kind of stasis as Ontario tries to figure out how to adapt its manufacturing economy. And then everything to the west is rich and growing, including places like Manitoba that doing remarkably well. That's going to have an impact on politics. When you have poor and getting poor, you have rich but troubled, and then you have newly rich and growing. That plays out in politics, and we can't say how it's going to play out exactly. It could lead to Quebec separatism reviving itself, in the sense that they have nothing more to offer us anymore. Let's go and be poor on our own. It may have Ontario cleaving ever more to the west. I think it will. I think that in fact this is something that's going to go on for a long time. But we can't say for sure. Mr. Manning.
Well, I think another factor that has to be taken into account, that one should not assume that the West is indifferent to this perhaps growing alienation in Quebec, but it'll come at it, and it'll suggest that the Quebec-Ontario alignment come at it in a different way than the Laurentian consensus might have approached. Both the West and Quebec historically have preferred a more decentralized federation. That is some very common ground that could be built on in the future. Also, both the West and Quebec are major exporters of energy to the United States. And there is a benefit in the hydro people in Quebec and the oil and gas people in the West, particularly Alberta, getting together and getting their act together when they bargain with the Americans. Now, these are two different grounds for the West doing work with Quebec and trying to tie Quebec more strongly into the Federation. It's different ground than the Laurentian consensus might have taken it, but the effect should be, if those two angles are pursued, should be to strengthen the ties between Quebec and the rest of the country, not weaken them.
Ernest, since you're in such a nostalgic mood tonight, let me follow up with this. Do you, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but do you miss Quebec separatism a little bit? Because at the very least, it sure kept English Canada together. And you seem to be mourning a loss of togetherness in English Canada these days.
Do I miss Quebec separatism? Well,
only insofar as it kept English Canada kind of speaking on the, singing out of the same hymn book.
Well, yes. I mean, it's certainly true that accommodating Quebec was central to the so-called Laurentian consensus, and that was part of nation building because of this original hostility that was there from the start. It never was overcome, but I certainly don't think that the answer is that Quebec is simply going to disappear from the political configuration. Quebec isn't going anywhere. It's geographically staying there, and it's going to have its say. So, as I suggested before, I don't think that this is the end of Quebec, and regardless of a new consensus. I'd like to bring the conversation around to something a little different, if I can, and that is what people around this table feel about the value, the centrist values of Canadians, which continue. I mean, we see that it is true. 60% of Canadians did not vote for the new coalition, for the Harper government.
Gotta watch the use of the word coalition and Harper government in the same sentence.
Yes,
but
right.
I think
well,
we get
in
what you
fact,
mean.
if there had been a coalition, it would have been a good idea to have a coalition. They were too scared, right? How is this centrist population going to deal? How are they dealing with the breakdown of parliamentary democracy, or maybe breakdown's too strong a word, the skirting, the end run around Parliament, with making policy that is not based on fact? I mean, you suggested that people who think that policy should be based on fact are not part of the coalition. Well, is that really the case? I mean, Mr. Manning may have something to say there.
Well, let me hear John Ibbotson first on this. How about on that issue that we had 10,000 people in the streets around the whole prorogation thing, marching up and down Yonge Street, saying that this was a new pro-democracy movement that, was nascent but could be turned into something of a political force.
Or not.
Turns out it wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know Andrew and I have disagreed on this. I can't remember the halcyon days when Parliament was a vital and active participant. I think in every democracy that's parliamentary, there is a steady erosion of the powers, not just of Parliament, but of Cabinet and the public service towards the centre. But I don't see any erosion of democracy. I just don't. We haven't had a majority government for a long time. We've forgotten that in majority governments, the centres of opposition aren't actually inside Parliament. They're inside the provinces. The premiers become the real opposition. And we're going to see that when the healthcare accord and the equalisation accord take place. But to Ernest's point, one of the things that sometimes makes me wince about the consensus is that it believes that there is received wisdom based on fact, on an Enlightenment tradition, and that's us. And then there are barbaric hordes, and that's them. And I just don't. I just don't buy that. I think sometimes what people, I think I said in the speech, my reasoning is your belief is his prejudice. Yeah. We are all creatures of passion, and we all tend to marshal facts, columnists included, behind what it is we want to believe, and then present that as the only reasonable alternative and everything else. And it's just not the case.
Okay, let's go around the table.
Well,
Go ahead.
My learned friend, I think, is relativizing a few things out of recognition. It's not true that it was always just as bad as it is now, and it's not true that it's just as bad in every democracy. There are differences of degree, if not of kind. I would agree that it has been a bipartisan project of eroding Parliament, that both the Liberals and the Conservatives. I don't think it's particularly new for the Conservatives to be doing. They're just building, they're standing on the shoulders of giants. The Liberals did terrible things to the Parliament, and they're doing even worse things. So I would hope that it would turn itself around at some point, but I'm not hugely optimistic in that. But I just can't agree that there's nothing happening to our democracy. I'm just not sure where that goes if none of the parties are prepared to take it up as a cause, and until and unless they can get the public to think it's a vital interest that they can win votes on, they're hardly likely to. So we're stuck in a death spiral in a way that the worse Parliament gets, the less people care about it. But I mean, to give you a very specific example, this government in the course of about 7 weeks invoked time allocation 7 times, a politer form of closure. The pipeline debate in 1956 that went on for 6 weeks or whatever it was, the biggest parliamentary fracas in our history, was ignited because the government invoked closure in peacetime. And people were quite properly scandalized that they should be shutting down debate on a vital issue like this. Nowadays, it happens and nobody, including the parliamentary press gallery, blinks an eye.
Preston Manning.
Well, I think if you take a longer view on this, that I take maybe the lesson out of the reform movement, that despite all the flaws in the current democratic system, and I've been a vehement critic of many of those flaws, a small group of people, started with 5, were able to take the tools that democracy gives to us all, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to try to persuade your neighbor to do this or do that, or support this or support that, and with all the flaws in the system, were able to change the national agenda. Not to the degree that we would have liked, but certainly changed it from what it was. And I give a lot of talks to people that are upset about various things, and I say those tools are available to you too. You've got to make the effort to use them, but they can be used to change the national agenda. And I think as long as that is the case, that the conditions for democracy are good in the country. The other point I'd make is in John's paper, and others have referred to, the Laurentian consensus was an elite consensus. It was a consensus among elites. Whether to the degree to which it was shared by rank and file people, or whether the elites even cared as to whether you could carry the judgment of rank and file people when they disagreed with it. I think this new alignment is, while it's got its own elites, I think it is more deeply rooted in rank and file people, and therefore is a more democratic expression than what the Laurentian consensus was.
John Duffy.
Well, I think Erna has tried to lift this maybe to a bit of a level that I think we should spend some time on, and that's what's this all for? And we've been talking essentially about how power is obtained, how it's held, what are the regional blocks, what are the value propositions that go into acquiring and maintaining power in this country. But I guess at the level of what ought to be, not just trying to describe and get a fix on what is, what really concerns me about this new political alignment, if you will, is that it seems to be purpose-built to govern very lightly, thrives in a low engagement political environment where politics itself has a very light footprint, where denigrating Parliament is actually good politics, because the more parliaments scream we're being denigrated, the more contemptuous they become in the eyes of the public. This is a sleight of hand that Prime Minister Harper did brilliantly in the campaign, and the Liberals walked right into the trap, aided and abetted by Jack Layton, may he rest in peace. And I think the overall purpose of this is to do what Mr. Manning is describing, to have a more decentralized federation, to have more of the political action and the policy action move out of Ottawa, and of course, move out of government into the private sector. And there's 2 things that make me worry about that. Number 1 is what Erna raised about Parliament. Number 2 is this kind of movement, I don't believe, is capable of rising to a serious national challenge. A 25% consent-based proposition about small government and decentralization is not going to be able to take on the industrial and energy and environmental transformation we need. I worry about its ability to protect and promote a national single-payer healthcare system. I worry about its ability to fight a violent economic restructuring that is underway on a worldwide basis. All of this has happened in fairly good times. All of these de-alignments, and I worry about de-alignment in the sense that it could fundamentally inhibit our ability to respond to the major challenges coming in the early 21st century. That's why I'm actually not subscribing to this new consensus, because I believe it's going the wrong way.
Preston Manning, let me get you first, then John Ibbotson.
Well, I think what the role of government that's emerging is this role, and at least the polling that we've done, where we asked people, like, you've lost confidence in government as the big solution to the big problems. Well, but you're not anti-government, so what is the role of government? And what came to the top in those kind of discussions, both in focus groups and in the National Public Survey, is the role of government as a facilitator and an enabler and a partner with other players. Now, that's not abandoning the role of government, and it's not an anti-government role. It's actually a role of government that the British have been searching for, both under Tony Blair's New Labour and under Prime Minister David Campbell's big society versus big government. And I think this redefine the role of government as a facilitator can address many of these national challenges and national problems, but it's coming at it in a different way than saying, here's big government and we have the answer to it all, just trust it.
And I agree that there is always room for that sort of exploration, but I don't want to have the traditional propositions on which this country's been governed reduced to a caricature of elitism. I mean, I'm the first person to say Liberals have misgoverned from time to time and have gotten arrogant from time to time, but that doesn't mean that Canada as a country can go in the same direction on the same explorations as Britain can. This is a country that is very fragile, strung out across a very large patch of territory, very small in the world. I worry about being one of the first countries to de-govern ourselves. That's one of the reasons I'm not a conservative.
And that's an interesting. No, go ahead.
No, I'm terrible.
One of the most interesting things about that is that point of view, and I'm not here to defend a conservative worldview, but there is a fundamental difference in the tone of voice here, which you hear, which is the Liberal voice and the Central Canadian Laurentian voice is one that speaks of the country as fragile, that speaks of their worry about whether this country can survive, of whether the next big shock will just sweep it all away.
And you're not sure that really exists?
I'm not sure that's the Canada that's in the mind of most Canadians right now.
I
think they look at a robust country, a country that is filled with immigrants who are living in an amazing diversity and harmony, that is expanding, that is growing, that is weathering storms that other countries are not weathering. And there is almost a new patriotism, as I said at the speech, arising that really is not concerned with this worrying centrist belief that Canada will at any moment fall apart if it's given a shove.
Erna, then Andrew.
Yes, Preston was talking about the role of government, and I think this is something that we really must think about as Canadians. Some of the things that the government is doing may seem irrational. I sometimes think of Alice in Wonderland, who said that the cat, she's seen a cat with a grin, but she's never seen a grin without a cat. Well, if you look at building prisons, that's a bit the grin without a cat, isn't it? But if you, and this may be an exaggeration, I acknowledge that. There was a 19th century political theory called the night watchman. And one can see it in the extreme reaches of the Republican Party today. And according to the Night Watchman, the government is responsible only for protecting citizens from crime and protecting the country from foreign aggression. So there are three priorities in government: police, prisons, and the military. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Conservative government is limiting itself to that, but I think if we look in that direction, then things that may seem irrational and difficult to understand can be understood in a context. And I think we have to begin understanding things a little differently.
Andrew.
This is a fascinating discussion about smaller government and de-governing and night watchmen. I just don't know what relevance it has to the government that's currently in place in Canada. This government, this Conservative government, is spending more per capita after inflation than any government in our history. We never got above about $6,000 per capita under any government before, in 2010 dollars. We're now spending $7,200. So the notion that they're de-governing us and that there's some kind of night watchman state is just beggars belief. In part, I think I'm glad that they haven't followed some of the things that one might have expected them. For example, on the federal-provincial thing, it's actually not true to call this government a decentralist government. They've been decentralist in some ways. In some ways, they've been quite centralizing. Harmonizing the sales tax, for example. They've been talking quite strongly about the economic union. So far, they've only gone on the national securities regulator, but the direction is clear. I describe Harper as more as a kind of a functional or a rational federalist than a decentralist. He very clearly has an idea that, and he's got some support from the Constitution, that social policy is the provincial realm and economic policy and the economic union is the federal realm, and let each do what they want. And that's not an indefensible position.
Have you read Peter C. Newman's new book yet?
I have not.
Okay, he describes Stephen Harper in that book as, quote, the best medieval mind in the Commons. There is something about Stephen Harper that provokes, in quote-unquote polite Laurentian circles, the most egregious responses. What do you think that's about?
Some of it's deserved and some of it isn't. It isn't to the extent that people, as John is saying, are treating the arrival of a different point of view and a different party as being the barbarians at the gate. I do think that betrays a kind of a blinkered vision. It's earned in the extent that he has a very harsh, very partisan, very controlling demeanor and political style. And I think people are right to be suspicious of that and to put up resistance to that.
How do you, Preston Manning, explain the visceral hostility that many in the so-called Laurentian consensus view your old friend Stephen Harper?
Well, I think, first of all, they don't know Stephen Harper. And Peter C. Newman has no more personal relationship or even exposure to Stephen Harper than the man on the moon. And so his impressions are gathered from other sources. When I was a young person, I once came home, my father was Premier of Alberta. I came home and vehemently denounced a local politician. And my dad listened to all of this, and then he said, well, like, have you ever, like, met the guy? Have you ever been in a room and listened to him or talked to him? I said, no, I hadn't. So he gave me this kind of a deal. He said, okay, you list a few politicians. Tell me what your current impression is, almost entirely gained through the media or through comments by their opponents. And I'll make sure that you meet each of them individually at some time over the next year. And then you tell me whether your first impression, on which I was quite vehement and convinced I was right, lines up with what you actually, the conclusion you come to once you've met them, seen them, talked to them, et cetera, et cetera. And in virtually every case, my view was different, and in many cases, almost all cases, more moderate and tolerant than when my view was just based on these distant impressions. And I think I know Stephen Harper as well or better than any on this panel, or certainly more than Peter C. Newman. And I'm telling you that these caricatures of him are false. They are completely false.
So bottom line here is we got to get Erna Paris to 24 Sussex for tea.
That's right.
Great idea.
We'll try to make that happen. Okay. I want to thank everybody for participating. You know, Coyne, are you loving this show?
Yes.
What do you think? Last week you came here 40 minutes on supply management. Tonight we're talking about the Laurentian consensus.
Your show just goes from strength to strength,
It
Steve.
gets wonkier and wonkier by the minute, doesn't it? I want to thank Preston Manning for being there on the line from Calgary, Alberta tonight. A great pleasure to have you, Mr. Manning, on our program tonight. And back here in our Toronto studios, there's John Duffy and Andrew Coyne on the right-hand side of the table, politically, not necessarily geographically, certainly. And on the other side of the table, John Ibbitson and Erna Paris. Thanks so much to you two as well.